Y'all exclusive audio of Julian Champagne and Victor Wembanyama immediately after the finals visiting some sick kids in a hospital to make their day. I love PR moves, yo. I love when niggas is trashing you because you've been a bitch-ass nigga and a French dick for about 2 weeks. Oh, you made this girl's day, man. Nothing more than having a big loser with some spare time show up to the hospital. Man, nothing better than, oh, look at it, handing out some toys to the sick kids. As a sick kid.
Victor Wembanyama just lost the NBA Finals. His team got eliminated on the grandest stage the sport has to offer, and the entire world was locked in watching every second of it. And when it was over, when the confetti rained down for somebody else, when the other locker room was drenched in champagne and celebration, most people expected Wemby to vanish, to go quiet, to grieve the loss the way athletes at that level typically do. Take some time away, process the pain, step back from everything for a while. But that is not what happened. The very next morning, less than 24 hours after one of the most crushing defeats of his young professional life, Victor Wembanyama walked into a children's hospital. Not for a scheduled media appearance, not for a photo opportunity with his team's PR staff coordinating every detail behind him. He just showed up. And he sat with kids who were fighting battles that make losing a basketball series feel like absolutely nothing. Kids who woke up that morning carrying something far heavier than a finals loss. And Wemby stayed with them, talked with them, and made them feel genuinely seen on what was probably one of the most painful mornings of his entire career. That is what actually happened. And when Joe Budden found out, he got on his podcast and called it a PR stunt. Then, as if that was not already enough, he took shots at Wemby for being French. Let me say that one more time so it lands the way it deserves to. Joe Budden is a man who has never competed in a professional sport at any level in his life. A man who has never felt the weight of a finals loss, never suited up for a game that carried real stakes, never had to sit at a podium after giving absolutely everything and still walking away with nothing. That man got on his podcast and told his audience that a 20-year-old's visit to a children's hospital was a calculated image move, and then had the nerve to mock where the kid was born on top of it. That is what we are here to talk about today. Because this is not just about one bad take on one podcast. This is about something much bigger than that. Victor Wembanyama is slowly and deliberately being constructed into one of the most polarizing and disliked figures in the NBA. And the story of how that is happening, who is pushing it, and what it actually reveals about the current state of sports media is a conversation that deserves to be had properly. So let us get all the way into it. Let me establish the foundation first, because context is everything here. Victor Wembanyama entered the NBA as arguably the most hyped prospect the sport has ever seen, and that is not an exaggeration. That assessment came directly from the people inside the league who have witnessed everything this game has produced. Adam Silver, the NBA commissioner, called him a once-in-a-generation player before he had played a single professional minute. Hall of Famers were going out of their way publicly to say they had genuinely never encountered anything like him. LeBron James, Kevin Durant, and Greg Popovich, all of them essentially delivering the same message through different words. This kid is operating at a level that has no real historical comparison. He is different in a way that the sport has not yet developed the vocabulary to describe. And in his first 2 seasons in the league, he backed every word of that up. He was doing things on a basketball court that should not be physically possible, blocking shots from angles that make no geometric sense, handling the ball like a point guard at 7 feet 4 inches, pulling up from distances that most players at his size never even consider because the math simply does not work. He was everything the hype built him up to be, and then some. The basketball world had already begun preparing the throne. So when the Spurs reached the NBA Finals, and let us be clear about how remarkable that achievement actually is for a young team that most analysts had completely written off 2 full seasons ago, the entire basketball world tuned in with enormous expectations. This was supposed to be the defining moment, the passing of the torch, the night the face of the NBA made himself completely undeniable on the biggest stage available to him. They lost. and the response from certain corners of the media was immediate, and then it turned vicious fast. Joe Budden, one of the most prominent voices in the New York media and podcast space, gets on his show and begins dissecting everything about it: the series, the performance, the body language, the demeanor. And then came the moment that genuinely set the internet on fire. He got to the hospital visit. And rather than allowing even a single second of grace for the possibility that this kid simply wanted to do something meaningful for someone else during the darkest stretch of his professional life so far, Joe went straight to motive, straight to manipulation. He told his audience it was staged, that Wemby, a 20-year-old still carrying the fresh emotional weight of losing the biggest game of his life, had sat down somewhere and coldly calculated that a children's hospital visit would soften the narrative building around his performance. I want you to sit with how genuinely cynical that accusation is. Because that take is not simply saying this felt calculated. That take is saying this person is so emotionally detached, so image-obsessed, so fundamentally cold that he looked at sick children and saw them as a strategic tool. That is the actual implication of what was said. And Joe delivered it with total confidence on a platform that reaches hundreds of thousands of people, and we're just supposed to move past it. To really understand why Joe went where he went, you have to understand the cultural backdrop this entire situation lives inside. Joe Budden is from New York, not just as a biographical footnote. New York is his entire operating lens. His perspective on sports, music, and culture runs through that filter first, and everything else comes second. And in New York sports culture, there's a very specific type of athlete that gets embraced without reservation. Loud, confident, brash, the kind of competitor who talks trash and then delivers on it, who celebrates hard and competes with that same fire, who wears every emotion visibly and dares anyone to challenge it. Wemby's none of that. Wemby is European in the most complete and genuine sense of the word, reserved, intellectual, precise. He gives press conference answers that sound like they were composed by someone who has absorbed far more philosophy than sports media strategy. He doesn't talk trash. He doesn't erupt after big plays. When he does something extraordinary on the court, he simply moves on, gets back on defense, like the play was always expected, like anything less would have been the real surprise. To a New York audience, to a Joe Budden audience specifically, that registers as arrogance. It reads as coldness. It reads as someone who has already decided they are above the competition and above the culture surrounding the game. And that perception, fair or not, has followed Wemby from the moment he stepped into this league.
So when the Spurs lost the finals, Joe did not sit back and approach the series with any real nuance. He did not break down what went wrong tactically or what Wemby needs to develop to get back there and finish the job next time. He came in the way New York media personalities often do when a player they were never fully invested in fails on the largest available stage. He came in with a point he had already prepared. On the podcast, the tone was established immediately. He talked about Wemby's demeanor throughout the series, his body language, and how he carried himself at the podium. And then, when the hospital visit entered the conversation, instead of pausing for even one moment to consider that what he was watching might simply be a young man trying to do something meaningful during a difficult period, Joe took the most cynical road available. He called it calculated. He called it image management. He essentially instructed his entire audience not to be fooled by it. And then came the French commentary. Nationality jokes in sports are not new. We have heard them directed at players from every country throughout the history of this game. But there is a meaningful and important difference between a light-hearted jab that lands and gets left behind and using someone's national identity as a sustained character indictment. What Joe did with the French angle was not a joke. It was framed as evidence, as if Wemby's nationality somehow explains something fundamental about why he came up short, why he should not be fully trusted, why the basketball world may have been premature in crowning him so enthusiastically. That is a different category of commentary, and it is a genuinely dangerous road to travel down. Because here is what people conveniently overlook when constructing these narratives about Victor Wembanyama. This kid has been competing at elite levels since he was a teenager in Europe. He left France at a young age to chase the highest level of basketball available to him. He arrived in a country where he did not grow up, where the culture operates in completely different ways, and where the media scrutiny is unlike anything the European sports world produces. And he managed it. He adapted. He improved every single season. He delivered on every promise that scouts, coaches, and executives had made about his potential. He led his team to the NBA Finals at 20 years old. And the angle now being used against him is that he is French. The French commentary matters because it represents the laziest possible form of sports analysis. It requires no film study, no tactical understanding, no genuine knowledge of what Wemby actually did or failed to do throughout that series or across the entire season. It is simple. He is French. And here is what that is meant to imply, according to a stereotype that has absolutely nothing to do with a basketball court. For a player already fighting against a segment of the media that was never fully bought in on the hype surrounding him, that kind of commentary creates damage that takes a very long time to repair. But I keep returning to the hospital visit because no matter how many times I examine it, I cannot locate the cynicism Joe claims is embedded there. People who have actually been around Wemby, not people watching him on television, but people who have genuinely spent time with him throughout his career, will tell you that this kind of behavior is not new or unusual for him. He was this way in France. He was this way in the developmental leagues before the spotlight found him. He has performed quiet acts of generosity throughout his entire career without press releases attached and without a publicist orchestrating the optics around them. The only reason the world found out about this particular hospital visit is that one person in that hallway had a phone out, and the moment reached the internet, the way everything eventually does. He wanted to make someone's morning better during the hardest stretch of his season. That is the complete story. And Joe Budden looked at that story and concluded it was a chess move. That reveals something important, and it reveals considerably more about Joe than it does about Wemby. Now, here is where I need to be genuinely honest with you, because this conversation requires a level of fairness that most people on either side of this debate are unwilling to bring to it. Joe Budden is not operating in a complete vacuum. There is legitimate frustration building around Wemby in certain circles, and some of it is rooted in things that actually happened on the basketball court. If we are going to have an honest conversation about why the negativity is growing the way it is, we have to address all of it. Let's start with the fouls. Throughout this postseason, there were multiple moments where Wemby was playing physically in a manner that a different player, a less prominent player, a player without his profile and platform, would have drawn considerably stricter attention from the officials. There were plays, particularly in the first two rounds, where his use of his wingspan appeared to cross the line from legitimate elite defense into something more deliberate. Moments where he was extending an arm into a shooting motion in a way that was not entirely clean. Moments where the contact was clearly visible on replay and the whistle was still not coming. Now, every elite defensive player in NBA history has received some level of benefit of the doubt from officials. That's a long-established reality of how this league has always functioned. Stars draw calls, and stars sometimes avoid calls that role players receive every single time. That has been true throughout the league's entire modern era. But the frequency with which Wemby appeared to escape meaningful scrutiny during this particular postseason run was noticeable enough to generate genuine conversation, not only from frustrated fans on social media, but from legitimate analysts, broadcasters, and people who cover this league professionally. And once that seed gets planted, once people begin watching through the lens of whether this player is being protected, every single possession gets processed differently. Every missed call becomes confirmation. Every borderline play gets filed as additional evidence. And by the time the finals arrived, a significant portion of the casual NBA audience was already conditioned to believe the league was extending Wemby a level of grace that was not being applied fairly to everyone else on the floor. Whether that assessment is entirely accurate is genuinely debatable, but the perception was real. It was widespread, and perception in the current media environment functions as the equivalent of reality when it comes to the damage it produces.
Then there is the post-game interview. I have reviewed that footage multiple times, and I want to be genuinely fair to Wemby here, because I believe there is a massive cultural gap that gets completely lost in this particular conversation. Wemby is French. He processes experiences differently. He communicates differently. In European sports culture, composure following a significant loss is not a signal of disrespect toward the moment or toward the opponent. It is considered a demonstration of dignity. You do not perform your grief for a television camera. You hold it internally and you move forward with your head up. That is the culturally appropriate response to defeat in the world he came from. But in American sports culture, and NBA culture specifically, fans need to see the emotion. They want it visible on your face and audible in your voice. When Kobe Bryant lost, the devastation was written across everything about him, and people loved him more deeply for it. When LeBron lost in 2011, the entire internet witnessed him breaking down, and even people who actively disliked him felt something genuinely human in that moment. Those visible displays of grief made those players more relatable, more authentic, more accessible. Wemby sat at the finals podium and answered every question thoughtfully, carefully, and with total composure. He did not break down, he did not display visible rage or anguish. He was controlled and precise, which is exactly who he has always been, and the internet tore him apart for it. He does not care. He is emotionless. He is arrogant. He acted as though losing a championship meant absolutely nothing to him. Those were the dominant narratives, and those were the clips that traveled everywhere. Not the plays he made during the series, not the moments where he was genuinely breathtaking on the floor. The 30-second post-game clip in which he did not cry on camera, that is the content that performed. That is the content people shared and argued over and constructed entire narratives on top of. And here's where Joe Budden's podcast enters the ecosystem in a way that matters well beyond that single episode. Joe has a large and intensely loyal audience. When Joe says something, his audience does not simply hear it, they amplify it, clip it, post it, argue about it, send it to other people, and suddenly a take that started on one podcast becomes the dominant conversation thread across the entire sports media landscape for 2 or 3 days. Other content creators respond to it. Other podcasters pick it up and run with it. Commentators who would never have gone as far as Joe did independently find themselves positioned right next to those arguments because the arguments are already circulating and the engagement numbers attached to them are real. That is the machine. That is precisely how it operates in this environment. And the French commentary traveled. People repeated it. People expanded on it. People who never would have gone there on their own found themselves in conversations where that framing was already the established starting point. Meanwhile, Wemby, who is 20 years old, still actively learning to navigate American media culture, still processing the biggest professional loss of his life in real time, is sitting at the center of all of it with no real infrastructure to fight back against a machine moving at that velocity. Now, I want to ask you something directly before we continue. I want you to actually think about this carefully. What would the narrative have been if Wemby had not gone to that hospital? If he had gone completely silent after the loss, stayed in his hotel room, kept everything private the way plenty of players in that situation choose to do? The narrative would have been exactly what a large portion of the internet was already constructing. He does not care about the community. He is disconnected and self-absorbed. He couldn't even show up for the city after a loss like that. But when he did go to the hospital, when he showed up the very next morning and spent real time with sick children, the narrative became that it was a PR calculation.
There was no version of Wemby's behavior following that loss that Joe Budden was going to examine and conclude was genuine. The incentive structure does not reward that kind of response. The incentive structure rewards the take. The hotter and more cynical, the better. And a 20-year-old's genuine act of human decency got fed into that machine and came out the other side completely unrecognizable. Let me pull all the way back now, because I believe the real story here is considerably larger than Wemby versus Joe Budden. What we're watching happen to Victor Wembanyama is a pattern the NBA has witnessed before, and every single time it is played out this way, the league has lost something as a result, something that cannot be fully recovered once it is gone. Consider what happened to Dwight Howard, not because Dwight was a bad person, by most accounts he genuinely was not, but because the media narrative machine decided at a certain point that he was soft, that he was difficult, that he represented a fundamental disappointment relative to the enormous expectations placed upon him. And once that narrative built momentum, it never completely stopped. His legacy is permanently shaped by a version of him that was largely constructed by people who had every incentive to build a villain and very little incentive to tell a more complicated and honest story. Consider Ben Simmons. Was some of the criticism of Ben Simmons fair and grounded in real things? Absolutely. There were genuine issues on the court that warranted genuine analysis. But at a certain point, the pile-on became something that had nothing to do with basketball analysis anymore. It became content. It became its own form of entertainment. And the actual human being underneath all of it, a young man who was visibly struggling in ways that extended far beyond his shooting mechanics, got completely buried under noise that served everyone except him.
Now look at Wemby. He's 20 years old. He has played 2 seasons in this league. He led his team to the NBA Finals. He is, by every objective, statistical, and analytical measure, one of the 2 or 3 most gifted players in the entire league right now. And if you spend any meaningful time on major basketball platforms across social media, you will find a significant and rapidly expanding segment of the audience that genuinely despises him. Not mild skepticism, not healthy critical analysis, genuine contempt. And that transformation did not occur because of anything he did on a basketball court. It happened because a series of narratives, some partially grounded in real events, many constructed almost entirely on perception and cultural bias, were built over several months by people who are compensated specifically to generate engagement. And in the sports media world, engagement requires conflict. It requires someone to root against. It requires a villain. Wemby has been placed in that role, and unless something fundamentally shifts, unless he engineers a moment so undeniable it reshapes the public perception entirely, or unless the media ecosystem decides there is more sustainable revenue in the hero narrative than the villain narrative, this is going to follow him into the most productive years of his career. And here is the part of this conversation that should genuinely concern every fan who actually loves this sport and wants to watch great basketball. If this trajectory continues, if the hostility keeps building the way it has been, if the pile-on keeps recruiting new participants every week, you are going to watch one of the most gifted players in the history of basketball divert significant mental and emotional energy toward fighting an image crisis that was largely manufactured by people who have never spent a meaningful moment in his position. His focus will be split between performing at the absolute highest level and managing a public narrative that has nothing to do with the basketball court. That is bad for the league, it is bad for the sport, and it is bad for everyone who tunes in because they genuinely want to watch basketball played at an extraordinary level. Because what this kid does on the floor is something you'll describe to people years from now. Whatever you think about his demeanor, whatever you think about his post-game composure, whatever Joe Budden thinks about his nationality, when Wemby is locked in and operating at full capacity, he is producing moments that belong in a completely separate category from what most players in this league are capable of. Blocks from angles that should be physically impossible, playmaking at his size with no historical reference point, shot-making that defies every expectation attached to his frame. You do not want to spend those years booing him. You want to be watching him the way you watch something rare enough that you understand in the moment you will never see it again. But I cannot close this out without returning to Joe one final time, because I want to be precise about what was wrong here and why it matters beyond this single situation. Joe Budden has built an entire career on being the voice that says what others are either afraid to say or too careful to say publicly, and I genuinely respect the craft of that approach when it is being applied with real honesty, when the take is sharp and aimed at something real, when there is actual substance underneath the provocative framing that justifies it. This was not that. This was a man with an enormous platform and a deeply loyal audience looking at a 20-year-old's hospital visit and deciding the most engaging available response was to call it fabricated, without a source, without evidence, without anything beneath it except cynicism and the particular confidence that develops when you occupy a platform where real-time accountability is rarely enforced. And the French commentary, I need to say this plainly because it should be on record, that was beneath him. Joe Budden is a sharper thinker than that take reflects, and has produced sharper takes than that within the same week. But using someone's nationality as a sustained character argument in a league where international players now represent nearly a third of the entire roster across the sport is not simply lazy analysis. It sends a message. It communicates to every young international player watching what certain corners of this media landscape genuinely think about their legitimacy when the results do not align with those commentators' expectations. That is a problem that reaches well beyond this particular story. Here is where we land. Victor Wembanyama is going to be fine over the long arc of his career. He is too talented, too young, and too internally driven for this moment to become the thing that defines him. He will return next season carrying something inside him that nobody has seen yet, because that is what genuinely great players do when the biggest stage sends them home empty. They sit with the loss, they process it fully, and they come back sharper, more focused, and with something to prove that goes far deeper than statistics. And when he does, when he returns to that final stage and the confetti finally falls for him, the same voices dragging him the hardest right now will be among the very first ones back on his side. That is the predictable and somewhat exhausting cycle of how sports culture operates in this environment. The villain becomes the hero the moment the scoreboard changes. But between now and then, real damage is being actively done to how casual fans perceive him, to help new fans entering the sport understand his name when they encounter it for the first time, to the overall narrative surrounding one of the most genuinely extraordinary players this league has produced in a generation. And a meaningful portion of that damage traces directly back to moments exactly like this one. A podcast, a careless and cynical take, a deliberate spin was applied to a young man who showed up for children who needed a reason to smile on a morning when he had more than enough reasons not to show up for anyone. The internet built a villain out of someone who walked into a children's hospital the morning after losing the NBA Finals, and Joe Budden sat behind his microphone and handed them everything they needed to do it. Make that make sense. If you have thoughts on this, whether you believe Joe had something legitimate buried somewhere in that take, or whether you think he crossed a line that needed to be called out directly, drop them in the comments below. This is a conversation worth having. And if you're new here, subscribe, because this is the kind of story we take seriously.